For our next extra credit here, we've got spread props. So what if I have an object of props that I want applied, and I'm actually just going to copy and paste this because that's exactly what I want for my example. So let's just paste that right here. I want to take these props and I want them applied to this div without having to say, okay, class name is props.classname and props.children. That's basically what I want to accomplish here, but I don't want to have to do this class name is props class name. What if this props object was like 30 things long? That like probably wouldn't be a super great idea, but I want to be able to do this. And basically what we want to do is we want to say, hey, I want to take all these props and spread them across the props position of my React create element call. So if I were just doing this with React create element, I'd say const element equals React create element div, and then I'll just pass props. And that would do me. I'd be like totally cool. And what if I had an object here where I had an ID of my thing, and then I also wanted to combine those props here? Well, the way that you do that in JavaScript with object is you use this object spread syntax, where you can say, I want to take this object that I'm inside of right here, and I want to spread all of the properties from another object. So I'll say ... props, and this will combine these two objects for me. So ultimately what I'm left with is a single object. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to console.log that object by itself so we can take a look at what that looks like. And now we'll get ID my thing, children, hello world, class name container, and the order actually matters here as well. So if I wanted to say my class name is default, and then we see what that end result is, we're going to see the class name is container because the props here, which also specifies a class name, comes later. And so whatever comes after or whatever comes later in this combination is going to be the winner in the event of a conflict. And so for that same reason, if I take that class name and put it on the other side of this spread syntax, then I'm going to see that same thing, class name is default, whereas before it was the class name was the container. And so now I'm overriding the values that are here in the props. So position matters here. So what does that have to do with our JSX that we've got here? Well, let me go ahead and we'll just comment that out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, I've got a div here, and thank you JSX for giving me a self-closing div. You can't do that in HTML. And then I'm going to say, let's take all these props and spread them on the props position of this div. And that's effectively doing the same thing that we had with the React create element call. If we save this and take a look at the compiled version of the JavaScript, then you'll notice we have React create element div props. And so this is actually understood by the Babel compiler, and they just take that props and stick it in the props position. Now, what if we wanted to say ID is my thing, like we had with this object spread? So this actually blows up a little bit because Babel is going to add this helper function called extends, which is basically object assign, which is kind of what this object spread syntax is doing. It's just kind of a syntax sugar on top of object assign. But ultimately what happens here is it's saying, hey, let's extend this object with the values from this object. And so we're going to just combine those two things. So it's basically doing an object spread here for us. Now, if I were to say, okay, I want my class name to be default, and we put it on the other side of the props position here, then we save that, we'll see the compiled code says, okay, we're going to extend this object with this value, and then also the values from this object. And that will effectively merge it together, just like we're doing with this spread syntax. And if we look at the final result, I want you to go ahead and take a guess at what our class name is going to be. If you guessed default, you are right. Congratulations, applause for you. And that's because we're overriding the prop class name from this props object to whatever the default value here is. And this is something that you typically are going to do a couple of times per application. You don't do this a ton of combining props like this, but sometimes it can be really useful to override the props that are coming here. More often, if this is really a default value, then you're probably going to put this right here. And then if the class name is defined, then we'll go ahead and have that class name that was defined be the one that we specify here. But if it's not defined, then we'll get that default value instead, which is exactly what we're looking for when it comes to a default value. So if you have an object of props and you want to apply them to a particular element, then the way that you accomplish that is using a spread syntax that's very similar to object spread, which is implemented in JavaScript. This is the JSX version of that same spread syntax. And then, of course, the order does matter, and it matters just in the same way that the object spread syntax matters as well.